Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Brandenburg, Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Middle East Security Initiative, and I'm pleased to welcome you all on behalf of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, the Global Business and Economic Center, and the South Asia Center to this timely and insightful conversation about the implications for European partners and for U.S. sanctions policy of President Trump's recent decision to withdraw the United States from the JCPOA or the Iran deal. The Atlantic Council promotes constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the Atlantic community's central role in meeting global challenges. We aim to provide a forum for navigating dramatic economic and political changes by informing and galvanizing a network of scholars, analysts, and leaders. Developing a coherent, comprehensive policy vis-à-vis Iran has challenged multiple past administrations. This is all the more so the case today, as we seek to understand how President Trump's recent decision will impact U.S. policy and our partners around the globe. In addition to the forum that you have joined this afternoon, I wanted to mention our newly launched web platform, Iran Source, which brings together a range of perspectives on a wide spectrum of strategic issues related to Iran. It covers topics from security and politics to business and society, and identifies the challenges, opportunities, and policy conundrums facing the U.S.-Iran relationship and that of our partners, as well as seeks to present options to address them. You can access it via the Atlantic Council's main website and list of blogs. With that, I will turn the floor over to Barbara Slavin to introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm really delighted that we are bringing together all of our Iran work now at the Atlantic Council under Iran Source. So I suggest all of you look at ampersand Iran Source, and you can also tweet today's event at #ACIran. Well, we knew we would have some interesting events last week. We weren't quite sure what, but certainly President Trump has given us a lot to chew over, and we are going to look at sanctions aspects in particular, what the announcement regarding the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA is going to mean for sanctions, for Iran, for our European partners, for our Asian partners. And we are very, very lucky that we have a last-minute addition to our experts, and that is the ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to the United States. David O'Sullivan is going to make some keynote remarks, and then we will turn to our panel of true experts on sanctions in particular and on U.S.-Iran policy. Let me just briefly introduce them. I think you all have their bios. Liz Rosenberg is Director, Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She is a veteran of the Treasury Department. She is one of the go-to experts in this town on sanctions policy. We also have a new speaker here, Axel Hellman, who is a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network, and he is going to address European concerns and concerns about the Trump decision for the U.S. alliance with Europe. We have an old friend of the program, Ali Vaez, Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group, who followed the negotiations that led to the JCPOA in great detail. And we also have David Mortlock, who is a non-resident senior fellow at our Global Energy Center and another veteran of State Department, and I believe also of the NSC, where he worked on developing the sanctions that are now going to be returning. So it promises to be a very, very interesting hour and a half. With that, may I ask you to silence your cell phones and let me invite Ambassador O'Sullivan to come and make some preliminary remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's just 7 minutes past 12, so it's no longer the morning. Barbara, colleagues, I won't hide from you that it is with a slightly heavy heart that I take the stage this morning. This was never where we hoped we would be. Maybe we shouldn't be entirely surprised, but that does not stop me from feeling the need to just express my extreme disappointment and regret at where we now are. We really deeply regret the decision which the President has taken. Of course, as I say, maybe we shouldn't be entirely surprised after all that's been said, but it is something which we feel puts us in a very difficult situation. The JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, as many of you will know, is perceived by the Europeans and I think by the broader international community as a strategic multilateral agreement. It's the result of international unity endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. And most importantly, and I think this is hugely important to say and to repeat again and again, the deal is serving the purpose for which it was designed, which is to prevent Iran from ever acquiring or developing a nuclear weapon. In other words, to make the world a safer place. It did not promise nor set out to solve all the problems of the international community with Iran, and certainly not the problems that we as the European Union and that you as the United States continue to have with Iran. But the strategic decision was taken that the single most important issue in our relations with Iran was the looming threat that Iran could become a nuclear weapon power, and that was the most important thing which needed to be stopped. And that is exactly what this agreement set out to do, does, and in our view will continue to do. Compared to the position before the agreement, the Iranian nuclear program has been significantly rolled back, and much more importantly, and this is perhaps the single most valuable asset of this agreement, has been brought within a comprehensive and unprecedentedly intrusive monitoring system. And the International Atomic Energy Authority has in place a robust verification system and undertakes on average 2 SNAP nuclear inspections per month. Since the start of the implementation of this deal, the International Atomic Agency has issued 10 reports that all certify that Iran is complying with its nuclear-related commitments under the deal. And I have noticed that in multiple appearances before Senate and other congressional committees, representatives of this administration have confirmed that that is also the view of the U.S. military and of the U.S. intelligence community. Now, I know none of this is new to you, and the outcomes of inspections and Iran's compliance has been widely reported in the region, in Europe, here in the United States. So we continue to believe in Europe that this JCPOA is a vital element of our national European security. It's also vital for the region and more globally. I would also add that it represents a key element of global nuclear non-proliferation architecture. It is probably the single most impressive piece of nuclear non-proliferation negotiation which has ever been committed to paper, and in that sense is the single most important working model of nuclear non-proliferation at a time when we're also discussing future possibilities for ending nuclear proliferation, for example, in the Korean Peninsula. Let me just deal with 2 myths sometimes propagated about this deal. One is intrinsic to the deal itself, which is this idea that somehow it's a deal that's actually only good for 10 years, and then after that Iran is pretty much free to do what it wants. This is absolutely untrue. It is true that there are elements of this deal, there are certain restrictions on the peaceful nuclear activity of Iran, which are subject to certain caps and ceilings over a period of time. The fact remains, this is a deal in perpetuity, where Iran commits itself formally and solemnly by international treaty never to acquire or develop nuclear weapons, ever. And the international community is equipped with the right to monitor and verify that commitment of Iran in perpetuity, in particular through the additional inspections permitted by Iran's adoption of the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is actually a treaty which is forever, and it is the definitive renunciation by Iran of the right to acquire or develop nuclear weapons at any time. Now, of course, can Iran change its mind as the United States has changed its mind? Well, yes, they could, but then they will be in breach of the agreement. And if they conduct activities which are deemed not to be compatible, we retain, as the international community, the full right to reimpose all the measures which we think are necessary in order to enforce the purposes of this agreement. The second element, the second myth I want to puncture, is that somehow for the Europeans this was all about money, all about making money in trade with Iran. It was European sanctions that brought Iran to the table in the end. We took some of the toughest economic hits. By the way, we generally do with these sanctions issues. If you take Russia, we trade 15 times more with Russia than does the United States. We also traded a great deal more with Iran than did the United States. So when we introduced these sanctions, yes, we took the economic hit. But ladies and gentlemen, we did so in the full recognition that it was important to show international solidarity and to prevent the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran. And we were not going to give up those sanctions until we were absolutely convinced that we had a deal from Iran which was enforceable and effective. It was only at that moment that we agreed that indeed the quid pro quo of this negotiation, and let us be clear, ladies and gentlemen, any international negotiation involves an element of quid pro quo. The quid pro quo from Iran was to feel that they would get some economic benefit out of accepting this considerably draconian and indeed unprecedentedly intrusive inspection system of their nuclear activities. And yes, it is true that it's natural that perhaps the Europeans, who had previously had more economic ties with Iran, would go back to more economic dealings. But frankly, we have no monopoly on that. And by the way, there has not been a huge rush by European companies, precisely because the chilling effect of all the debate about whether this agreement would continue, whether sanctions might come back, has frankly meant that I think there's only been a very limited amount of economic benefit for Iran, and that's something that we have to think about. So we Europeans believe that we are bound to continue to deliver on our commitment if we want Iran to stay in the deal. We want the economic dividends of compliance to be felt by the people of Iran, and we believe that that will be ultimately probably one of the main drivers of future reform in that country. Now, in this spirit and on the back of that obligation and our deep commitment to maintaining in place this agreement, because we think it is absolutely vital not to permit the development of nuclear weapons by Iran, we will have to consider how to address the negative impacts of any primary or secondary sanctions which may be reintroduced by the United States that will affect European firms. And we will work on options to protect EU economic operators from the possible extraterritorial effects of reimposed US sanctions. The JCPOA is a long-term international agreement, and we count on the continued unity of the international community to preserve the deal, even without the United States in it. One of the key elements of multilateralism is predictability and maintenance of agreements over time. The European Union will maintain its commitment to the JCPOA as long as Iran does the same. High Representative Vice President Mogherini responded immediately on behalf of the European Union and its 28 member states, and her message was clear. Our commitment to the JCPOA and determination to act in accordance with Europe's security interest. We do not see a credible, peaceful alternative to the JCPOA. Frankly, the United States has not yet suggested a credible alternative, neither before nor since the President made his statement on the 8th of May, and we wait to hear how this administration, what this administration thinks such a credible alternative could look like. We've met with the administration following the announcement to clarify some of the implications, and in the coming days we will host a number of meetings among our member states and with our partners to assess the situation. The High Representative has convened a meeting with the UK, French and German foreign ministers tomorrow, followed by a meeting with the Iranian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mohammad Zarif. And European leaders of heads of state and government will discuss Iran at an informal dinner on Wednesday evening in the margins of the Balkan Summit in Sofia. So if I may conclude by quoting the High Representative when she said in her remarks on the 8th of May, "This deal belongs to each and every one of us. We expect the international community to continue to do its part to guarantee that the deal continues to be fully implemented for the sake of our own collective security." So, Barbara, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I just want to say by way of keynote remarks, but I want to return to my initial statement. It is with a very heavy heart that I deliver these remarks today. This is a difficult moment. I hope we can find a way through, but we are going to face some pretty difficult discussions, I fear. Thank you. Yes, I can't stay for too long, but I will take one or two questions, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. My question involves some conjectures, so I do apologize. But what do you think is the likelihood of reinforcement or reissuing of blocking regulations on secondary sanctions? And two, even if blocking regulations are used, what do you think, I mean, given the lack of strong European investment in the Iranian economy post-JCPOA, why would they now invest in the Iranian economy given the threat of secondary sanctions?
Well, I understand the question. You'll also understand today I'm not in a position to give you detailed answers. We are engaged with conversations with the administration, firstly to understand exactly how this is going to unfold from the US perspective so that we understand what we're dealing with. We will be discussing in Brussels and elsewhere this week how we can possibly respond to that. And we may have, I'm sure, something more to say about that later in the week. But the other point I want to make is this is not just about the ability of European companies to do business in Iran. There are other people out there, China, India, Russia, who can do business with Iran. We should not make this sound as though the US and the EU dominate this arena. So, I mean, the whole point about the previous situation was that we had built an unprecedented international coalition of China, Russia, the three European Union member states and the EU as a whole. And that meant that the sanctions truly had impact. I very much doubt that it is going to be possible to reinstate anything like that international consensus, given that it is the United States which is walking away from a deal which Iran is actually committed to implementing. And in those circumstances, I think while we may have some tensions between the EU and the US on this sanctions issue, we should not forget that other people will be perfectly able to continue to do business with Iran. So this is not a sort of closed circuit, which is only a debate between the EU and the US on this issue. There's a gentleman here in the front who's...
I'm going to take my prerogative as a moderator and ask you a question, if I may, Mr. Ambassador.
Pulling rank.
How much damage has this decision done to U.S. relations with Europe in the context of the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, the complaints about NATO spending, the trade disputes over aluminum and steel? Thanks.
Well, I mean, it's true to say that we're going through a slightly turbulent period in transatlantic relations. I don't want to sort of get now into a kind of quantification. We've had disagreements in the past. We'll have disagreements in the future. The strength of the transatlantic alliance and the friendship which binds us is tremendous. And so I'm sure that we will try to work our way through this. But yes, this is a moment of great difficulty between us on this issue where we clearly are not on the same page.
Oh, thank you very much. Ambassador, a few months ago I asked you the same question. You said, Europe is ready to enact legislation to protect its interests. Is your answer the same as a few months ago? Are you willing, is Europe ready to enact legislation to protect its interests? Thank you.
We are still studying exactly what will be the issues which arise from the manner in which the United States will put back its sanctions and the implications for European companies. I mean, I note that a Chinese company, apparently, which was found in contravention of Iran sanctions, is apparently going to be no longer held to account for that. So that maybe opens up the possibility of a certain flexibility in the way in which this could be approached. But when we better understand exactly how this is going to be managed, we will decide how best we respond from the European side to defend the interests of our country, of our companies, but also to protect Iran's legitimate expectation of renewed economic activity as a result of their respect for this deal as part of that fundamental bargain at the core of the JCPOA. Thank you very much. I wish you an interesting panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've got a lot to get through. I think actually I'm going to start with you, Ali, if that's okay. As somebody who has followed the negotiations, who has followed U.S.-Iran relations, I wanted to come to you in terms of two things. First, what does this mean for any possibility of reconciliation between the United States and Iran? And secondly, do you think that Iran will actually be able to stay within this agreement absent U.S. participation?
Two very good and difficult questions, Barbara, to start with. Look, in terms of long-term implications, it is obviously difficult to predict, but if you put it in the context of at least the past year and a half, I would argue that it is for the first time following Iran for many years that I'm seeing enmity towards the United States, which was always a top-down process, turning into a bottom-up phenomenon. It's for the first time that I see Western-educated Iranians don't understanding why the U.S. is doing this to them. And it's not just the nuclear issue, by the way. It's the broader context of the Muslim ban, of calling the Persian Gulf Arabian Gulf, which is the best way if you want to provoke Iranian sense of nationalism. You must pronounce Arabian Gulf instead of Persian Gulf. And add to that, the fact that licenses for civilian airlines, which again is something that is directly related to the quality of life and safety of Iranians. All of this combined together has, I would say, has given credence to the arguments that the hardliners had for years and years, and the enmity that is coming from Washington is not just against the system, it is against the Iranian people. It is against Iran as a big country which can play the role of a regional leader. They even put the Iranian leadership at the moment, its narrative is, look, Prime Minister Mossadegh trusted the United States. Look how he ended up. And Khatami started negotiations with the United States. Look what that happened. The axis of evil. Rouhani has entered into this agreement and has delivered 100%. What's the point? And I see for the first time that idea is gaining currency within the society. And also take into account that we're talking about a very young population that has almost no experience with the revolution and the war. Mm-hmm. So for them, this is the most informative experience that they're having now with the United States. Now, to go back to your first question, I would say, if you allow me, I would like to look at this in two different levels. So there are two blame games here that are determining the outcome of this process. One is the international blame game. And Iran, from day one, I would say, even during the negotiation, their plan B was to make sure that they can win the international blame game. And this comes out of the experience of the sanctions era. They realized that the only reason that sanctions were so effective during the Obama administration was that Iran was seen as the inflexible party at fault. And sanctions are as effective as they have multinational support and are applied internationally. And they said never again. So we have to make sure that this will not happen again, and we're not isolated and securitized and seen as a threat to international peace and stability. We have to act as if we are really delivering our end of the bargain. So they delivered 100% on the JPOA, on the interim agreement, and also on the JCPOA. And I think Rouhani has managed to, again, create a consensus around this idea that they have to stay in the deal and take this to as far as possible to demonstrate that Iran is not the inflexible party at fault again. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei came out a few days ago and supported this idea. So I would say, when it gets to the strategic direction, long-term options, I think the Iranians will stick to the deal, waiting to see what happens in the negotiations with the P4+1. Obviously, a P4+1 plus Iran against the United States is a much better arrangement for them than P5+1 against Iran.
Sure.
Now, there is also the domestic blame game that is at play here. And here, the situation is different because, yes, there are debates around whether Iran should enter into JCPOA plus, giving more to the Europeans on maybe on regional issues, maybe on human rights, maybe on banking reform, FATF, etc. And in return ask for more from the Europeans that they have so far willing to offer, or whether Iran should accept JCPOA minus, which is to accept that without the US the dividends will be even less than what they were before, but maybe this is enough to carry on in the next few years.
This is my question, and we'll talk about it with the whole panel, but if the Europeans, despite the brave words of the ambassador, are not really able to protect their companies or incentivize their companies to stay in Iran, can Iran survive by simply selling its oil to China, India, Turkey, and basically reorienting its commerce almost entirely toward Asia?
Survival, yes. They can't thrive without any doubt, but they can survive. But I think politically the situation is not very tenable. And the reason is, and this gets to the second part of my argument, which is that if you look at the milestones in Iranian politics, in 2020 there are parliamentary elections, in 2021 there are presidential elections and local elections. And there's obviously the prospect of the Supreme Leader's succession looming large in the horizon. And there is a lot at stake. It's the fate of the system, which will definitely be determined by the next Supreme Leader. And there's a lot of vested interest in the economy. If the system is closed, there's an opportunity, obviously, for the Revolutionary Guards and others to once again monopolize the economy. If there is competition from multinationals, it's a different situation. That's why I think if Rouhani fails as the last-ditch resort to try to save the deal with the P4+1, I doubt that he would be able to maintain the deal just as an arrangement between Iran and the East.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Axel now. Again, you heard what the ambassador had to say. He was not very specific about the measures that Europe might take. Are there measures that Europe can take? Is it realistic to expect that European companies, when faced with a, $18 trillion US market and a $400 billion Iranian market, that they are somehow going to put principle ahead of expediency and choose Iran?
Thanks, Barbara. I think the first thing is that we're not really sure at the moment what the EU will do, and I think what the ambassador said reinforced that. They've been relatively quiet on what measures they would take if Trump was to pull out of the deal. And I think there are two reasons for this. The first is the foreign ministers from the E3 are primarily focusing on the consultations they had with the United States and the US counterparts over the period leading up to the decision. So I think they really want to stick to quiet diplomacy for a last effort to really make the deal work. And I think that they were mindful that any open statements on more confrontational measures could easily derail those negotiations. The other reason for that, though, is that if we look at the plan B, it's really not too tempting. There is no silver bullet for protecting European investments in Iran, even though there are a number of options on the table. But each of those options, as I see it, and I think as most people in Europe see it, they are either technically or very politically complicated. So if we look, for instance, on the blocking regulations, there are simply at the moment, I would say, too many question marks about how that would play out. It sounds very good theoretically that the EU would enact legislation that would protect investments in Iran, but if you look at how that would actually play out, it's a very technically complicated process. And particular for a private sector, I'm not sure that it would actually give them the confidence that they need, that they will have continued access to the Iranian market. So I'm afraid I'm becoming more and more pessimistic that there are concrete measures that the EU could take at this point.
What about the state-owned, state-run entities? I've read, I think in your own paper that you put out for European Leadership Network, that the European Investment Bank, for example, might be able to extend guarantees. There are other banks that are have heavy government involvement in them. They're credit agencies and so on. Could they not pick up some of the slack?
Well, first of all, thanks for reading my paper. I'm glad someone did.
I did. That's why you're here.
Well, so let's start. There are really 2 points to your question there, but let's start with the IEB, the European Investment Bank. It's they're going through a long process at the moment on which they're gradually moving Iran to the list of eligible countries where the EIB could operate. So that's a process that is ongoing. It's probably going to take another few months to really move them onto that list. Once that is done, though, it is time for European negotiators to draw up a framework agreement with their counterparts in Iran. So this is likely to be a pretty drawn-out, complicated process. The real significance of that right now, rather than technical, I think, is political. It's really showing a commitment from the EU, particularly to the private sector, but also to Iran, that we are committing to continuing business with Iran. So that's the first thing. The other thing that you're alluding to is setting up so-called protected credit lines. We've already seen a few of these initiatives on way. We see this happening in France, it's happening in Italy, Denmark, and so on. Essentially, what it would do is that you would have work with credit export agencies and banks to establish credit lines to Iran denominated in euros rather than US dollars. So that theoretically you would circumvent the reach of US secondary sanctions. It will have some impact, I think, but the problem is when I talk to businesses about Iran, everyone says, we're really interested in this market, we see a huge potential, we want to do business here. The problem is the banks. You then go to the banks, and the banks simply say that, well, we would love to do this, but the risk is simply too high. We can't take the risk of penalties from the US. And that's really where the sticking point is. And then, of course, you have European policymakers saying, well, we encourage this. Right. But if you're a big bank, you're really relying on access to US capital markets. You're relying on having the ability to process international payments in the US dollar. So the hesitation and the risk aversion among the big banks will simply continue to have a really chilling effect on investments in Iran. Having said that, I think what these measures could do is that they could encourage investment by smaller companies and smaller banks to keep some economic activity going with Iran. And I think the hope among policymakers in Europe is that this will be enough to tell Iran that, look, you're better off staying with the deal with us than you were under the sanctions regime.
Okay. Liz, this is a good segue to you. I'm going to ask you again the China question that I asked Ali. China, because of the size of its economy and so on, seems to be very well placed to create new entities that could trade and invest with Iran and invest in Iran without any reference to the US dollar. Do you anticipate that this is what is going to happen? And we have some experience of this already during the period of heaviest sanctions when we had an international consensus. China was still buying Iranian oil, and I don't believe it was even reducing its imports of Iranian oil very much.
Oh, that's a rich set of questions there. About that. Thank you very much to Barbara and to the Atlantic Council. I'm very glad to be here with you all for this important conversation. So I'm glad for the opportunity to focus on China and East Asia because it is certainly, while it's certainly appropriate to talk about how European companies and political leadership will respond, not merely because they've laid down some markers and public statements, it's not necessarily President Xi's style to offer the same declaratory policy or set of offers of protection for Chinese companies, but that doesn't mean at all that we should neglect the fact that they may be doing so, in fact, quite actively in private. And so it's a good question, you know, what can Iran sustain economically if it only trades with China? But if it only trades with China, China is an enormous purchaser of Iranian crude. They purchase about 600,000 barrels per day right now, but it has spiked up to 800 and 900,000 in the past couple of months.
So nearly half of what Iran exports, right?
Yeah, and it's possible that they could find ways not to diminish that purchase, even if there's some on the surface plan to significantly reduce. And let me put a pin in that. We'll come back to talking about what that means. So just to say that under the prior intensive period of sanctions on Iran, there was a requirement for countries still purchasing Iran to significantly reduce within 180 days, lest some of their banks be subject dealing with Iran, the central bank and other financial institutions be sanctioned. So it's a little complex. We'll come back to that if you want to talk about those details. But about China in particular, there is an opportunity to continue, including in a manner similar to what happened in up until 2012, when it was highlighted by CISADA sanctions, the Bank of Kunlun, which was processing oil payments for China in violation of the sanctions, and then continued to do so afterwards. And this also, there are other independent traders who purchased Iranian oil that evaded in various ways, including through the Gulf. And there was an intensive effort, David, you'll remember this, to get after loopholes and evaders and quote Omani crude blends that were not Omani crude. And in fact, actually, traders have noted that before last week, new blends of Omani cargoes are already on the market that are not Omani crude. So people dusted out that playbook, and it's already started. So China has this enormous amount of leverage to comply a little, to comply a lot, to comply not at all. And that's the biggest challenge for the United States if there's really a power struggle to occur between foreign purchasers of Iranian oil or foreign commercial actors doing business with Iran. And that will be the site of the real showdown, not with European leaders, as you were just mentioning. And I want to just briefly say something about President Trump's Twitter indications about ZTE, the Chinese telecom company today. You may think this is unrelated, but it is not. It's a massive Chinese telecom company that was against which sanctions enforcement actions were taken for its violation of Iran sanctions and North Korea sanctions too. And when President Trump indicated that he would work with President Xi to alleviate some of the economic harm for this major Chinese company and the jobs lost because of these enforcement actions, I see it as directly undercutting the threat of U.S. imposition of these new Iran sanctions when he's just told China that if your president comes and makes nice with me, then we will figure out a way to lessen the pain. So what exactly does that mean about the plan here for imposing these Iran sanctions, or what does it signal about how you may be able to get out from under certain things if your political leader is savvy enough to, your head of state is savvy enough to try and do a deal with President Trump? So I fear that this confuses and muddies the water for many people trying to do right by this set of sanctions, which is to say, I should say, approach a legal path forward, and it opens new opportunities for people who want to strategically contemplate evasion, avoidance, or political negotiation to go around them.
David, to you, you were an architect of these sanctions. You know how hard it was to put them all in place. How hard will it be to bring them all back? And in particular, coming off of what Liz just said, I mean, there are so many negotiations going on now on multilateral and bilateral basis. We've got aluminum, steel. Do we have any clarity? Even though President Trump said he was going to bring back all the sanctions and more in his comments last week, it looks as though he might be willing to perhaps have a carve out here or a carve out there. I'm thinking in particular of Total, which is the only major European oil company that's actually gone into Iran, has invested $90 million in a big gas field. Can you envision that there would be these kinds of deals that would be done? And how much more does that muddy the whole picture for people trying to figure out whether they should indeed wind down their business by next November?
Sure. Well, thanks, Barbara. I think, I mean, you've essentially got two big questions in there, which is, the first being how do you actually put the sanctions back in place? Can it be done quite easily? I mean, I think it can, right? It's a lot of work for lawyers in the government, but we've already seen some pretty extensive guidance out of OFAC about how these sanctions are going to come back into place. And it's pretty clear that they will simply roll everything back in that was in place in 2015 going into the JCPOA. What is not included in there is how that actually all plays out, right? How is resuscitating the state of U.S. law in 2015 bring us to the goals that the president laid out in his speech last Tuesday for a better negotiated deal with Iran? Because we can see what's happening though is that the statements from Europe about remaining in the deal, remaining committed to implementation of the JCPOA, as everyone here knows, are not the entire story. And essentially, I think what's going to happen is there are some pretty clear consequences, such as revoking General License H and reinstating prohibitions on foreign subs of U.S. companies. That's pretty clear how that's going to play out. The secondary sanctions, I think, is a tougher question. But at the end of the day, for most companies, even though the actual imposition of sanctions is not a common event, is usually preceded by a visit from the U.S. government, the reality is that the reputational and commercial risk of infringing on U.S. policy interests in Iran for most companies are not going to be worth the price of admission. And I share Axel's skepticism that there may be any actual legal steps that Europe can take to ensure that Iran continues to receive the commercial benefits promised to it from European companies. The reality is that the blocking statute in the 90s was largely a political signal from Europe. It was never enforced against any company. I mean, how do you force a company to go and do business in Iran or Cuba at the time? The biggest difference in the 90s was that you had a crisis in transatlantic relations that was created by a Congress and imposed upon an administration that actually was concerned about their relationships with Europe, and as a result came to a diplomatic solution. Obviously, that's less of a case today. So I think that the reality is that what we'll see from companies over the next 6 months is a pretty rapid winding down and respect for what those sanctions are. I will leave two open questions for others on the panel here, which is, number one, how does that get us from A to B, especially if we're going to start issuing carve-outs and exceptions, and I completely agree with Liz that the statement on ZTE sends a very mixed message about enforcement of US sanctions. And number two is, I think what I haven't addressed is at the end of that 6-month wind-down period, there is going to be a collision not just between the United States and commercial private sector interests, but between the United States and foreign governments over their purchases of oil. So I'll leave those open.
I'm going to give you one follow-up, and this is something that is of great concern, and a colleague of ours, Yar Batman-Glij, wrote about this morning on his website, Bourse Bazaar, and that is the whole question of humanitarian trade with Iran, food, medicine, medical devices. These items are not supposed to be sanctioned. They have not been sanctioned. I believe it was back in 1999 that the Clinton administration lifted all prohibitions on this kind of trade, even with countries like Iran, Cuba, and so on that were under sanction. I understand now that under the measures that the Trump administration is taking, every Iranian bank will now be on a designated list, will be on an SDN list, if I'm not mistaken, which means that it will be almost impossible for Iran to finance purchases of wheat and corn and MRI machines and pharmaceuticals from the United States, and possibly even from Europe. So if you can shed any light on this, is there a need for OFAC to come out with some clarifying guidance on this issue in order to prevent ordinary Iranians from once again suffering the impact of these sanctions in a really dramatic and direct way.
Sure. Well, I think I've got good news and bad news for you on that front. I mean, the good news is that the rolling back of the sanctions lifted under the JCPOA will not affect the licenses that are currently in place for the export of food and medicine and medical devices to Iran. Those had always been issued pursuant to statute that required the licensing of such exports, and in fact, in I think it was 2012, OFAC converted those specific licenses to a general license that now appears in OFAC's regulations, and any person can use that general license to export medicine and food to Iran, subject to the conditions they are in. There's no expectation that license will be withdrawn or altered in any way as a result of the JCPOA flip, particularly as that general license was issued at a time when we were considering a dual track of building up sanctions, but also trying to indicate to the Iranian people that we were not against them, and we were trying to give them access to humanitarian items. That's the good news. The bad news is that what is very likely to happen is we end up in a situation following that general license, which is it is still going to be incredibly challenging to find banks that are willing to do business with Iran. I will leave you, well, and to reply directly to your question about designated Iranian banks, every major Iranian bank,
private and state,
will be placed back on the SDN list. That's where we got by the time we made that change in 2015. Is essentially any major Iranian bank had made its way onto the SDN list, so that will be the case again.
And let's remind everyone that SDN refers to
it's the list of specially designated nationals and block persons.
Nationals and block persons, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, maybe I could finish with somewhat of a speculative silver lining, which is over the past 2 years, a number of financial institutions around the world have found access to the Iranian market. It is true most major European banks have not gone into Iran over the past 2 years because of the compliance risks and costs. But there have been avenues opened up over the last 2 years with some banks that have used some legal but creative mechanisms, and perhaps there's a chance, despite the addition of the SDN list, despite the negative direction of U.S. sanctions, perhaps that creativity can now still help with those exports that remain legal.
Yeah, Liz, if you want, I see that you want to add something to this, but I wanted also to well, do you have anything to add to this point on humanitarian trade? Let me ask you that first.
I mean, I think you've covered it. Just to say, the implication of all those banks going on the SDN list is that they can't then be part of facilitating the trade in Iran, just to be explicit about the point. So that's why the necessity for all this creativity. But what a state we will be living in, and more specifically Iranians will be living in, if the only way to get insulin drugs is to creatively engineer with small regional Southeast Asian banks.
Yeah. And I did want to ask both of you, what happens to SWIFT, the procedure for electronically doing these transactions with Iran? Does that now become inapplicable to Iran, or is that not clear yet?
Oh, this is a very good question. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about SWIFT in the last 48 hours, particularly, as people digest the first set of implications about these measures and then realize, oh my God, like what does this mean for? It's the more technical way to think about Iran's financial connectivity to the global financial system, and SWIFT is a Europe-based financial payment messaging system, and it basically has virtually the corner on the market now because it is very good at what it does. It's secure, it's very efficient. It has the benefit of everyone in the world really understanding how it works, which is a tremendously valuable commodity in this world. And so what those of you, I think it was Ambassador Sullivan who was saying that it was the European sanctions that were so forceful initially. Well, one of the things people mean by that when they make this point is that the mechanism that that implemented what we think of as SWIFT sanctions was European, not American. But to be, in all fairness, it was urged along in Europe by pressure specifically from the U.S. Congress, but a coordinated discussion from the U.S. administration and Congress. But Europe got ahead of that, I think fortunately for everyone and the clarity of the global financial system, by taking its own action. So the United States can try and cut off these Iranian banks on the sanctions list, on the SDN list, in various ways to try and forcibly sever their connectivity to the global financial system if Europe doesn't. But it will have to do so differently than occurred before, because if Europe doesn't instruct SWIFT to dump these same banks from the use of its financial payment messaging system, then the United States will have to look to other ideas. And the leading idea that urged on the Europeans to do this themselves back in 2011 going into 2012 was that the U.S. should name all the SWIFT directors, so basically the head of every global financial institution. So that is the architecture of the entire global financial system, and because of the outrageous potential implications of that, other avenues were sought. Now,
name, but you mean designate them?
Correct.
Oh my goodness, sanction them.
Yes. So one thing that the experience of Russia sanctions may have taught everyone in this space is that there may be a new way to name these people but insulate the sanctions effects just to them and not to everything they own and control, like naming the head of Rosneft or Gazprom but not having that attached to the entire company. But and there's really no shortage to creativity in the way OFAC could approach it. But the takeaway here is that the U.S. administration will have to do it on its own, presumably, and that could have some pretty significant implications.
Okay. Axel, I'm just going to ask you on this. Do you think that Europe will protect SWIFT? Do you think that's one thing that they could do against U.S. pressure?
At it, yeah.
Yeah? Okay. I'm going to, Ali,
Can
go
I
ahead.
just add, because I sense and I share the doubts of our co-panelists here about what Europe can do, and I think skepticism is definitely warranted, but fatalism is not, and I give you a few reasons. First, Europe by definition, and I can afford to say this as a non-European, does not take the right action until push comes to shove, until they get into critical territory. If you can afford to muddle through, that's the best option that they will pursue. But now we are in critical territory, and I think the Europeans realize this. I draw your attention to the remarks of French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire last week, which were really unprecedented. I mean, this is like a de Gaullian rhetoric that we haven't heard from France since 2003. French Finance Minister talking about the U.S. considering Europeans as a vassal state, and that they're not going to fall in line only because the U.S. president has decided to take certain actions, or that Europe should put together an OFAC, because why is OFAC the one that is dictating what should happen in the global financial system, or that Europe should create specific financial channels that are immune to U.S. sanctions. This is 2 weeks ago, this was impossible to imagine. But now it is, and it is certainly because of the way that the administration handled the negotiations with the E3, dragged them to the last minute, pushed them to make concessions, and then dropped them and decided to withdraw from the deal. And also, pushback from Europe has worked. Look at the Russia sanctions. Look at the question of tariff on steel and aluminum. So there are ways, if there is political will in Europe, that I couldn't sense. I have spent at least 2 months in the past 4 months in Europe. I couldn't sense until 2 weeks ago, but now it is there. So there is momentum, and there might be ways that they can do it. Our organization, International Crisis Group, published a report on May 2nd with a set of ideas, because I agree with Axel that there is no silver bullet solution to shield European companies who are interested in doing business with Iran, maybe not multinationals, but the medium and smaller European entities. But if the Europeans offer a package of incentives to Iran, then maybe the total sum of the political and economic weight of that package would be more than the sum of its individual elements. And maybe that would be enough for the Iranians to survive in the next few months to 2 years. Because also, and I've heard this from Iranian officials as well, it took 13 years to negotiate this deal. If we're talking about another 2 years, and in case the Trump administration either changes its mind or is history, then it's worth saving this deal for the next 2 years.
Yeah, that's been my argument to the Iranians, to hold on because regime change will come to Washington. Yeah, yeah. Very good.
So can I respond to that?
Axel, did you want to add something?
Yeah, two quick things. And we might want to talk about the transatlantic partnership aspect of this later on, more in depth. But just to pick up on what Ali said, there's really growing pressure in Europe now from civil society, from media, on policymakers to take firm action here, and I think that might actually, change the way that European policymakers approach this. I mean, just to give an example, I read in 2 major German newspapers this morning that the transatlantic partnership is dead.
Der Spiegel had an interesting cover last week.
Yeah, they called for resistance, which was
for those of you who may have seen it.
So that's the first thing. Pressure is really building up. There is a lot of frustration in Europe at the moment over U.S. policy. The other thing I would add to, because we were talking about potential measures to encourage business activity in Iran, beyond the big moves, such as going to the WTO or enacting blocking legislation, or even working with credit lines, I know that the EEAS is really looking into new creative ways of what they can do.
EEAS?
EEAS.
European Action Service.
Yes.
Okay.
So they're looking at what they could do to encourage perhaps mainly smaller companies to do business in Iran. So is there anything that European policymakers can do to help them with due diligence? Because a lot of European companies says that the due diligence costs in terms of manpower and just fees are discouraging. So they're looking at ways of working with the private sector, and I know that they keep that dialogue open. And I've been in several meetings with European companies recently where we have these discussions, like, is there anything that the EU could do to work with due diligence? Can we make some sort of white list? Now, you mentioned the SDN list of people that you can't do business with. What if there could be a list of people that you can do business with, that you have a good tracking record and so on? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's definitely too early to tell whether that will be enough, but just to pick up on Ali's point, I think all these measures combined might be able to send the message to the private sector and to Iran that at least keep some activity
going. It's worth it to hang in there. Very quickly, and then I want to turn
to respond to that. I just want to play out that scenario, right? And not disagreeing with you at all, but just where we end up, if you're right, that there is a chance that Europe encourages its companies to stay in. We see the same from China, as Liz suggested might be the case. And 6 months from now, 90 days, 180 days from now, the sanctions come back into effect. And in fact, European, Asian countries do not reduce their purchases of oil by November, right? And that's enough to keep Iran in the deal. But what does it mean for U.S. sanctions? What it means is the United States is then faced with the prospect of, do we start sanctioning the companies of our closest allies, or do we do nothing and start making exemptions and exemptions? And under either scenario, it's like a choose your own adventure where all the outcomes are bad, right? But under either scenario, either you end up with this ugly choice that the United States is in the 90s, but I think even more extreme, where if we do nothing, our sanctions become feckless, and the next time we try to use secondary sanctions to affect behavior, whether it's on Russia or North Korea or Hezbollah or whatever the next crisis is, the rest of the world goes, we know they're not serious. We know that threat isn't real. And yes, you may end up with Iran still in the deal, but for the United States and sanctions as a tool, It's very damaging.
I wrote something about that myself just the other day.
It's
So,
really
anyway.
great timing with North Korea, too.
It's great timing with
Great
North
timing.
Korea, absolutely.
Yeah.
Quickly, or I really do want to turn to the
quickly.
audience. Yeah.
Just from, if I leave my European perspective for sanctions, I look at this from the US point of view, and
Right.
I remember this from when I was working with Liz here in DC, that an emerging concern among US policymakers was that, look, if the United States is seen as overly using their financial leverage on an international scale to push your political agenda, what can the long-term implications of that be? You're talking about sanctions overuse and other countries potentially looking at other financial structure. It was all really but it was a concern that was really starting to take form here. And, well, I think, this is really adding to that concern.
This is the test.
This is a test indeed. You've been very patient. Dick Morningstar. Say your name. Is it on? I don't hear it. You got another mic? Thanks. Yeah, that one doesn't seem to be. No. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dick Morningstar from the Atlantic Council. One thing that we haven't talked about, is the cow irretrievably out of the barn? Is there still room for negotiation between the United States and Europe over the next 6 months? Is it too late? And no matter what the U.S. does, even if the sanctions turn out to be feckless, or even if there is an agreement with Europe at this point, will there still be an indefinite chilling effect, at least on major investment in Iran, because of uncertainty as to what may happen? The other question, is there a way, do you think, for the EU to look at this issue beyond Iran, and to put it also in terms of the economic and trade negotiations that are taking place, or hopefully will be taking place with Europe, and to basically go beyond blocking legislation if it becomes necessary, but also raise the stakes with respect to tariffs on things that may be very important to U.S. industry?
Axel, I think that's for you. Yeah, why don't you?
So on the first question was that, well, I used to think that there would be room for some kind of negotiations between Europe and the United States, and that there would be room for diplomacy. Not as much anymore. I think for those of you who watched Trump's statement, he was really quite clear. We might think whatever of his strategy, it is certainly not a detailed one, but it seems to me that there is some kind of strategy. I think President Trump believes that by reimposing all sanctions on Iran and put further economic pressure on Iran, that he can sometimes force them back to the negotiation table and make what he calls a new, better deal. If that's the strategy, giving any kind of exemptions for the Europeans to continue even minor investments or business activity with Iran would run completely counter to that approach. So I've become more pessimistic that there will be any willingness on behalf of the United States to do that. Before the actual announcement, I thought that given that there is a great deal of concern, particularly in Congress, for European concerns and for the transatlantic link, that they would be open to have some kind of negotiations.
The Europeans are not going to be willing to come back, I should think, after the experience they've had.
No, and I think too that they are mindful that Iran is very likely to give in to these new demands. So I see the prospect for the new better deal as it's not going to happen. I don't know if Liz wants to jump in. Or,
I do.
Yeah.
May I, Barbara? Yeah. I am inclined to agree. For the Europeans who are saying the transatlantic relationship is dead, it's hard to see any love found there. However, and so I've been feeling quite pessimistic about this for a while. With the set of President Trump's tweets about China and ZTE, I'm now thinking actually the kind of deal that of a fashion that may be in the offing is between President Trump and the United States and China, which it's not a JCPOA kind of deal. It's a deal of another sort entirely, but it has to do with the way in which sanctions will be imposed and tolerated, and maybe an exchanging of measures around the US-China broader trade issues, and how much pain shall be imposed pursuant to a set of sanctions measures. There's also concerns about tariffs. So that is not a nuclear arms control deal. That is not a deal among security partners. That's an economic.
Are you saying that China would trade away some of its commerce with Iran in order to get other benefits from the United States?
Perhaps in the trade realm. I mean, I think that's where China, which has proven itself to be an excellent strategist with the United States when it comes to economic trade and IP and critical industries, and insinuating itself quite well in the United States, and has an enormous amount of leverage, now has this massive lever to pull with the United States about how much it shall supervise its companies to comply with Iran sanctions if it may get some other concessions from the United States on trade and tariff terms. So a deal, the only deal I see happening has to do with the economic relationship between the United States and China.
Interesting. Ali, Iran has said it's not coming back to negotiate anything after seeing what happened to the JCPOA, but are there any circumstances, do you think, under which Iran would return to some kind of negotiating, at least conversations, say, with the Europeans, if not with the United States, about any of these issues?
With the Trump administration, it's very difficult to imagine because, first of all, Iran's first step is likely going to be to trigger this adjudication process in the deal in order to get the rest of the P5+1 to officially condemn the U.S. as the violator of the deal. I mean, the U.S. was violating the deal even before the president's decision, but now it's in clear non-compliance with the agreement. So, and that's a huge political victory for Iran. I mean, people underestimate this. For 4 decades, the U.S. has put Iran on the international stage, has condemned it as violating international norms. For Iran to be able to get the other 5 powers involved in this to condemn officially, to say the U.S. is in non-compliance, is a huge political victory. They're not going to let that go.
Right.
So once that happens, I think, again, the objective is to see if they can get an arrangement between the P4+1 and Iran. But at the same time, I think the president himself, President Trump, has indicated that he's interested in a better deal. I'm not sure if that's the perspective of people around him, who mostly, I think, are seeking regime change. So even if you want to negotiate with the president, you have to go through his people who want either a clash with Iran or military or regime change. So it's very hard to imagine unless there is a personal channel directly to the president. I don't see where that would come
between
from.
the supreme leader and the president. I don't think so.
And that the president is willing to understand Iran's legitimate security concerns and is willing to put more incentives on the table, then maybe one can imagine. And there are a lot of ifs in what I said. But what I always, when I try to explain Iran to Western officials, I always say, it's not a bizarre mentality, it's a bazaar mentality. So it's always, it always depends on what you give them in return.
Sure.
And I think actually a deal with President Trump is harder to get, but it's likely to be easier to maintain. A deal with President Obama was easier to get, but harder to maintain. So I don't close the door on it entirely. But just to add to what Liz was saying, I also don't see much interest from China to get into a trade-off that Liz was explaining. Because if you think strategically, this is the only place, the Middle East, this is the only place in the world that is going to have oil in the next 100 years. And Iran is the only country in that part of the world in which the U.S. does not have a foothold. So if China helps the U.S. to achieve its objective, that balance would be lost.
Sure. And there's Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, China's counting on Iran for a lot more than just oil. Yeah. Right there. Wait for the mic. Say your name.
Hi, Zashalom Anderson. I was always trying to explain to European policymakers that their companies are actually not regulated in Brussels, but in Washington. And I fear that they now kind of learning it the hard way. And what I'm kind of fearing for the foreseeable future is not so much like they're coming to this realization with respect to Iran, which I think is kind of a lost cause because there are no real instruments available to implement this political will to actually keep up the deal. So I'm kind of worried with respect to Russia. If you compare Russia to Iran, Iran is not really that much important economically for the European Union. Russia is very much important for the European Union, and if you look at the recent sanctions under CISARA, they're already kind of, CATSA, they're already CISARA-style sanctions in CATSA, and you could have exactly the scenario which plays out right now with respect to Russia, which is way more important to the European Union. And then if you have European companies being regulated in Washington, kind of withdrawing from the Russian market, this will kind of be way worse, I think, than the fallout we're witnessing right now. And I'm not really seeing, given the self-emasculation of the European Union during the past, by supporting this extensive kind of interpretation of U.S. jurisdiction and also going along with secondary sanctions, how this might kind of be solved in a kind of constructive manner. So I just wanted to kind of point out the spillover effects with respect to Russia here.
Then anyone has any comments on that, or do you want to, Liz? Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I think the people who are involved in the Russian market are learning a lesson that people. So Europeans involved in the Russian market are learning a lesson that Europeans involved in the Iranian market learned a while ago, which is that risk is very big and it's very scary, and it could be very costly, and it may cause you to wind down certain relationships. And the U.S. sanctions policymakers are proving themselves more and more creative in how they may get at you. So I think European banks have long known that their regulators are in Washington and the Southern District of New York, and but European companies are learning this lesson too, and I think people thought that it would be contained to North Korea and Iran, and in fact, actually, the net is widening quite a lot. That's one lesson of the Russia measures.
Just to add, I completely agree with everything Liz said. I just add that. Keep in mind the concept of secondary sanctions is still fairly novel. This is something that really weren't deployed in a broad way until the last decade. And I think as Barbara mentioned, when Liz and I were in government and putting these measures together and building the regime on Iran, it wasn't done this way. It was done over several years. It was done with broad international consensus on the problem we were trying to address. And it was done with thousands and thousands of hours of outreach and explanation and guidance to foreign partners and foreign companies. So far, very little of that exists with respect to the sanctions that are going to come back into place in 6 months. And I think we saw similar problems with CATSA, actually, right?
This is the Russia sanctions.
This is the Russia sanctions. If you actually look at the legislation that was signed into law in August, it was pretty broad and in some ways quite clumsy, and was refined significantly by guidance from OFAC and the State Department to make it what secondary sanctions are designed to do, which is deter specific behavior. And so I completely agree. This is going to be a very different scenario than it was between 2010 and 2014.
Just a question there. You say that secondary sanctions are meant to deter. Have companies actually been prosecuted for violating secondary sanctions?
So, great question, right? So I think this gets to the heart of the sanctions here is, there's a lot of what is prohibited, right? What is prohibited, and that can even extend to foreign banking if they're using a U.S. correspondent account and transacting in dollars over wires. Or now if you're a foreign sub of a U.S. company, you can be prohibited from doing business in Iran or Cuba. Companies tend to be very careful about that because there are penalties and fines and even potential criminal penalties attached to that. The secondary sanctions, though, are different, right? The goal is to, how do we stop a French company doing business in Iran with no nexus to the United States whatsoever? It's by threatening that French company with blocking them from the United States. And that's a lot of what is now going back into effect with Iran. But of course, it's the ability, look, we used to get a lot of criticism from Congress of not sanctioning enough banks. And the argument we kept making was, well, by the time you sanction them, you've lost, because they are doing business in Iran that you don't want them to do. And so really those secondary sanctions are premised on deterrence,
right.
And the effectiveness of that deterrence is premised on the credibility of the US threat.
Okay. Yes, Rachel, you get another one. Wait for the mic.
Hi, thanks for a great panel. Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. My question is, what is the role of Congress and all this? Specifically, if it looks like there could be some potential deal with China that would alleviate some of the secondary sanctions harm, and the Iranian regime is not going to collapse because of the reimposition of sanctions, what does this mean for Europe? Are they kind of just the losers in all of this because they're not big enough or strategic enough to get a special carve-out for China? And if that's the case, should Congress contemplate any kind of legislative action over Trump's head?
Anybody want that one? It's like Inara, take 3. Yeah. Thank you. That was a rich set of questions there. And let me just praise the question, because it is it's appropriate for us to be thinking about all the spin-outs of this scenario, which have this broad array of political and economic considerations that I think people are really only just starting to grasp. So with respect to the role of Congress and some of these various scenarios that could play out, Congress has increasingly over the last 20 years taken a bigger and bigger role in the creation of new sanctions authorities and in the oversight of their implementation and enforcement. With respect to Iran, it took a big stand in the 2015 INARA legislation, and it really shifted into a much higher gear last summer with the CATSA legislation signed in August. And in both of those, there was sort of a policy principle of tie the administration's hands, if you will, or force them in a specific direction in the conduct of foreign policy. And what's challenging about that is that, of course, it's the product of a particular political moment, and the political moment changes, which is why INARA has come to behave in ways no one ever anticipated in this administration, and I'm sure CATSA will in the future too. Just think about that. But Congress may, I can't see why they wouldn't have their own say about Iran sanctions, and it could be a kind of course correction, if you will, from what the administration does. It could be a double down, which would have the effect of being politically neutral for them because they're not taking any political stance different than the president. So that may be a safe place for many Republicans in this Congress. Or they could decide to try and force the president's hands in a particular direction. Like if he decides that a Chinese financial institutions or oil company that is doing business with Iran may continue to do so, independent of the rest of his administration, maybe Congress will have something to say about that. So I can't see how they would sit on their hands in this circumstance when they have not done so for the last so many years, particularly the last sort of 5 to 8. And the same outside interest groups that supplied much of the intellectual capital for the various sanctions bills through 2012 in particular, and have supplied much of the same intellectual capital to the current administration, they're not going to rest on their laurels. The same motivation is still at play. Of course, they're giving their thoughts and ideas to the Hill and hoping that they'll run with them.
Harlan, you had a thought? Yeah. With the mic.
I'm Harlan Ullman. I'd like to expand the boundaries of this discussion because it's not just Iran and the JCPOA, but we have 2 other fairly significant events taking place. Talks in Korea on June 12th about denuclearization. They have an interesting trajectory. They could succeed. God knows what that means. North Korea is not going to denuclearize, but they could fail.
I don't think we're going to get that far, but that's just my view. Anybody else? Ali, you want to? I mean, Iran and North Korea are such different countries, and Kim Jong-un can make a decision. He can make it stick. Iran isn't quite like that. That's why it took 13 years to get the JCPOA. But any thoughts that all of you have on whether this show of strength by President Trump is actually going to help him with Kim Jong-un be irrelevant? What do you think?
Well, the president certainly believes that. But as you said, Barbara, the Iranian case and the North Korean case are quite different, and there are a few differences here. Obviously, the most important one is that we already had a deal with Iran. So, once the deal is collapsed, I think with it is trust in dealing with the United States. And the Iranians have a long memory. I feel 2018 to diplomacy with the U.S. would be a similar precedent to 1953 to U.S. involvement in Iranian politics. That's one major difference. Second, as Barbara said, Iran is not a hermit kingdom. It actually has politics, and it's very risky for any other Iranian politician or administration to engage in direct negotiations with the U.S. anymore. For sure, Zarif and Rouhani would not be able to do it. So we're talking about post-2021. The door is closed on that front, I think. At the end of the day, North Korea has the ultimate deterrent in its hand. Iran doesn't. Iran gave away most of its leverage. So if there are going to be new negotiations, I think the Iranians will have to reconstitute the leverage that they lost. And that's why we are likely to get into another cycle of escalation if the deal completely collapses. And at the end of the day, North Korea has a security guarantor. Iran doesn't. And that's where there is another risk, which I think if the Europeans manage to keep the deal alive with China and Russia, and those who were seeking to kill the deal in this town do not succeed, their plan B might be to raise tensions in the region so that there is actually more friction between Iran and the U.S. In Yemen, in Syria, Iran and the U.S. and its allies, by the way, not just the U.S. So that in this way we will move towards some kind of a confrontation that then would make sustaining the deal between the Europeans and the Iranians an impossibility. The last point I make is that I think the lessons, people mostly talk about what lessons the North Koreans would learn from this experience with the Iran deal. I'm actually more worried about the lesson that the Iranians learned from what the North Koreans have been able to achieve, which is that the only way you can get a deal with the U.S. and force the U.S. to the negotiating table is to develop nuclear weapons. Otherwise, you either end up like Iran, you give away everything and then the goalpost will be moved, or that you end up like Libya, like Gaddafi. So, I'm more worried about that because I'm also starting to hear from Iran, people were very serious, like National Security Advisor in Iran, talking about exiting the NPT if the deal collapses. This was, again, an impossible thing to hear 6 months ago for a country that always used to say, strategically, religiously, there's a fatwa from the Supreme Leader, we don't want nuclear weapons. Now they're talking about maybe that's the way to go.
Axel, did you want to add something about the parallels, if there are any?
Yeah, well, so your other part of the question referred to the EU, and that's also Ms. Morningstar's other question, which I didn't really respond to. We constantly hear now this term being thrown around, that this is doing immense damage to transatlantic relations, that it's undermining the transatlantic partnership, but we rarely specify what that would actually look like in practice. And I think that's important to look at. To me, that answer really comes in two different parts. I think on the one hand, neither side wants this disagreement to affect other areas of the relationship. I think here in the United States, particularly with the US Congress, there is a great deal of concern for the transatlantic partnership and a recognition of how mutually beneficial that is. Meanwhile, on the European side, my sense from the meetings I've had at the E3 foreign ministers is that they will try to compartmentalize this, meaning that they will try to keep this disagreement to the nuclear deal rather than letting it spill over into other areas of cooperation, which I think that we have seen we haven't really seen any fireworks from the main European leaders yet. Having said that, though, this is serious, and we're seeing a growing sense of frustration within Europe over unilateral US policies. And just to illustrate this, I think one of the most disheartening things I've heard in my consultations with European diplomats was one senior official telling me that, look, what's the point? At what point will you say, what's the point of policy coordination with the United States? So in some ways, I think we might see foreign ministries in Europe start to question the very foundations of the relationship with Washington. I mean, security has always been a cornerstone of that relationship, and from a security point of view, this is really kicking the EU in the teeth. So, I mean, yes, long term, I think we could really see long-term consequences. And the last point I would like to make is that we see a lot of references being made to Iraq.
2003, absolutely.
2003.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into whether this is, Iraq again or so on. I think it's not. But one important thing that I would want to make is that 15 years ago over Iraq, to a large extent, we saw the division playing out within Europe. A key question for European leaders became, do you or do you not align with US policy? We're not seeing those dynamics today. This time, the split cuts right through the Atlantic, where we have the United States on one side, and the European continent and European leaders who are all saying that we remain committed to the JCPOA and to the full implementation of the JCPOA. And I think that's the last point that I would want to make here.
We are unfortunately out of time, but that's a perfect segue. Tomorrow afternoon, we have two members of parliament from Europe, one from France and one from Germany, who will be coming, and we're going to talk about the whole question of transatlantic relations and what this dispute is doing in terms of popular sentiments toward the United States. So I encourage those of you who come back for that one. And thank you very, very much for coming. Obviously, we're going to have to do a lot of follow-up on this in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you to my speakers, all very, very good. Thank you.